In this part of the lecture, we're getting to probably the more familiar Cold War, the actual conflicts, although the conflicts we pick out might not be the ones that you're most familiar with. And so here's the lecture outline for this portion of the lecture. We will look at that division of the world, and we'll also look, as I say, at these places where the Cold War becomes rather warm. We're going to look at that division of the world, and to some extent we're going back to Communist China, because the arrival of Communist China is a really important step in the development of the Cold War. Russia and then the Soviet Union doesn't really have any natural allies until the emergence of Communist China. And so this is an extraordinary matter in world events, because for the first time, the Soviet Union has got a natural ally. They even sign a Treaty of Alliance in 1950. But there's been a long history of conflict between China and Russia. And one of the things I discover as I keep on going as a historian is historians are important because we remind you about all the grudges that we have, and these grudges are important. There seems to be a natural alliance between those two countries now, that two empires, I guess you could say. Now that they're both communist, they're right next to each other. There's that treaty in 1950, but there's this long history of enmity. And so it doesn't last very well. And Stalin actually has a policy of autarky, of supplying everything for the Soviet Union within the Soviet Union, of not reaching out. And China's much the same in this period. So they're both nationalists. They're both looking to autarky. They're not really naturals, those two states, at forming alliances. And there's this history of conflict as well. In addition, they deal quite differently with the United States, and that becomes quite important. Certainly, Mao and China are much more gung-ho in their dealing with the United States. The Soviet Union is much more cautious. In his memoirs, which were written in 1974, Nikita Khrushchev wrote that in 1957, Mao had told him, "We shouldn't be afraid of atomic missiles. No matter what kind of war breaks out, conventional or thermonuclear, we'll win. As for China, if the imperialists unleash war on us, we may lose more than 300 million people. So what? War is war. The years will pass and we'll get to work producing more babies than ever before." Now, it might not be true. Maybe Mao never said anything like that, and Khrushchev misremembered or made it up in 1974. He's not entirely reliable. Or maybe Mao did say it, but his target was Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. Mao might also have been rubbing it in a bit because of Khrushchev failing in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's a sign of tension. One thing we can be clear of is it's a sign of tension between these communist states, and that communist conglomeration only lasts a decade. The armies actually fight on the frontier between the two in 1968 to 1969. So there's armed conflict between communist China and the Soviet Union. And it's a very long frontier. If you look at the map there, you can see what a long land frontier that is. And so it ties up both of those states, and it ties up a lot of the Soviet army in being prepared to defend it. And having had Mao say that about the Americans, well, actually, in the early 1970s, China starts to talk to the Americans. And we get that famous episode of ping pong diplomacy, where the United States players are invited to play friendly matches in China in 1971. And that's what it's called, ping pong diplomacy. You can find books on it. So I should put a reference in the further reading to the book on it, because the latest book on ping pong diplomacy actually quotes my uncle. He was there earlier than the Americans, and they're there to play ping pong. I'm no sportswoman, but my uncle is a ping pong champion. China had already started opening the doors to foreign players using the sport. They'd been invited to the World Championships held in Beijing in 1961. And funny things happened to the Chinese team. You know, there's one competition where the Chinese team is actually purged between events because it's the height of the Cultural Revolution and people who are not ideologically sound stop turning up. My uncle, when he was there, was there in the period of the Great Famine, and he reminisces about
how this affected, well, the players. It wasn't made visible to the players at all. Of course, China projected its best face, but he says that the people on the bus said, look, if you're not going to eat all your lunch, can you please put the boxes aside for us? Because they were starving. So we get this divided world, and despite the fact there are these two communist states next to each other, there's actually, surprisingly, that's one of the breakdowns in the divisions that occur. But there is a massive difference. I've said both the United States and the Soviet Union were anti-colonial, but that's about the only thing that they see eye to eye on. There are massive differences in ideology between the two, and it's astounding to me, who's fairly pragmatic, the lengths and the conflicts that will emerge over ideology. And so these conflicts between how we should structure our societies, how we should operate our economies, lead to a decades-long conflict and a decades-long division of the world into what's referred to as a bipolar world, a bipolar and nuclear world from 1945 to 1989. And in that conflict, you can see clearly coloured on the map, the strongest players were the United States and the Soviet Union. They are the superpowers. And they emerged from the Second World War in a position that they go on to fight this ideological conflict. As I said, the United States didn't have fighting occurring on its landmass. It comes out of it in an excellent position. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, has been badly damaged, but because it was already on a permanent war footing, it just keeps rolling on. Both of them as well grab what they can in the race to Berlin. And so grabbing that section of Germany, grabbing Eastern Europe, adds to the resources. Middle and Soviet and satellite states, rather than states that are directly part of the Soviet Union, but they're still satellite states. That adds to the resources that are commanded by the Soviet Union. And they vie for the allegiance of nations elsewhere. And so this is the origins of the Cold War, these ideologies that develop of communism, of capitalism, and the friction there. It's briefly buried during the period of fighting Hitler, but as soon as that's over, and it's pretty much as soon as that's over, it springs up again, and it springs up with even more force. Both superpowers in this period seek to project, to extend their hegemony across the globe with alliances. The United States formalizes that with the Truman Doctrine of 1947, where the United States pledged that it would support free peoples resisting subjugation. It's got an interventionist policy. This is the opposite to what had occurred after the First World War, where the United States sought to disengage from the world. Here it's seeking to engage and to intervene as necessary to contain communism. And this is very much the language that is used. And in this bipolar world, it's not so much an iron curtain. I think it's a fun hall mirror that divides it. When something happens on one side of the iron curtain, something similar but not quite the same, some distorted version occurs on the other side. So we've got the Truman Doctrine. The Soviet Union was also committed to reaching out. In Western Europe, the United States does this with the Marshall Plan, which is established in 1948, where it reaches out and it provides money to rebuild Western Europe. And this is one of the reasons that Western Europe is able to rebound from the Second World War. That the United States, in order to fight communism, unleashes money. And they might be in the form of the loans, but it's productive loan lending, and that these states rebuild themselves. And the idea from the United States is if you rebuild as a wealthy capitalist society, communism has no appeal. And so it's in its interests to do this. It's a different policy that it pursues in Western Europe to the policy it pursues in Latin America. And it's quite a sharp contrast. And we should keep both of these views in mind when we consider the Cold War and the actions of the United States. So the United States since 1933 had had a policy of non-intervention in Latin America. This changes during the Cold War. And it supports anything that's not communist, including some quite nasty fascist regimes. And so the United States does send or does train people. It sends supplies, including armaments, to support rebellions against governments, elected governments, that are seen as too left-wing or too close to socialism in Latin America. So that's going on there. In Western Europe, it's sending money and supporting the building of democracies there. The Soviet Union comes to match that. As I say, it's a fun hall mirror. And so it develops Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, in order to supply support to its satellite states in Eastern Europe and also to promote development there. Then there's a shift from economic allegiances to military ones. So there's the establishment of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which is that if the Soviet Union attacks any member state, all the member states go to war. So it's seen as being a significant deterrent to the Soviet Union invading Germany, for example. And so there are a whole lot of American soldiers posted in Germany, maintaining that presence and being ready to fight as required should the Soviet Union act and invade. And it's a real risk for a long period of time. The West comes up with NATO. The East reflects that in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact, which is much the same thing, but for countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so this leads to militarization of the Cold War. There's less competition through prestige of just looking good. There's now a build-up of armed forces and of bases in various places on either side of that Iron Curtain. And there are fears too, particularly in the West, of an international communist conspiracy, in the sense that that's got to be stamped out, that while we're ready to fight this physical war, we must also be concerned at the internal ideological war and not be undermined from within. There are attempts to extend NATO to Southeast Asia with the creation of SEATO, which is signed in Manila in 1954, but it only lasts until 1977. NATO is still with us. That's because most of the members of that treaty organization actually came from outside the region of interest, and because it didn't address the concerns of the Southeast Asian nations who were supposed to be looked after by it and who generally weren't terrified of communists. And it also didn't work because the Americans didn't put their guns where their mouths were and so didn't supply military aid in the way that it did to countries within NATO. SEATO was described by an American diplomat as a zoo of paper tigers. It's quite a nice description. But these alliances that you can see building on this are important in making the Cold War into another global war. The alignment is developed to either the First or the Second World. So First World is capitalist, Second World is communist, and Third World is underdeveloped. It's an interesting way of seeing the world, and it's very much a Cold War way of seeing the world. So you've got the definite First World capitalist nations, the definite Second World communist nations, and then in your reading you'll find these unaligned states, or the developing world, the Third World, where that ideological conflict is waged in terms of looking for allies and looking for people to subscribe to one world or the other. And there is a definite aim by the two superpowers to claim allegiances, as many allegiances as possible, and to force these countries to go one way or the other. It doesn't always work for them. And that reading on the non-aligned movement is very interesting. But it's not just an ideological conflict. It does break out into a real one in various places at various times. And one of the early Cold War conflicts occurs actually in Berlin in 1948. So the maps, if you have a look at them, they show you the division of Germany, the Russian zone of control over in the east, the British, the American, the French. But Berlin itself, if you look at that little map inset, is also divided among the Allies. Berlin is way over in the east, it's way over in the Russian zone, and yet it's a divided up city. And once you grasp that idea of geography, suddenly its significance as a Cold War site becomes clear. It gets mentioned in the culture of the Cold War. There's a fear that Berlin will fall. And once Berlin falls, it's all on. It's the last bastion of the West, over in the East. And we've got to hold on to it because Okay? That's the front line. And so in 1948, you can see all these routes leading through the Russian zone, the air routes, the rail routes, the highway routes, water routes, leading through the Russian zone to supply Western Berlin. And in 1948, the Russians block them. But Berlin does not fall. It can't be allowed to fall. Instead, there are 11 months of airlifts to supply West Berlin. They're flying in everything. They're flying in the milk. They're flying in the coal. There's everything that, and imagine this just after the war. And the expense of it, you can tell I'm pragmatic, the expense of it in terms of airlifting all this stuff into the city. And yet they do it, and they do it for 11 months. It's estimated that they took in more than 1.5 million tons of coal and estimated 2.25 million tons of supplies all up. And the height of the Berlin blockade, and Allied aircraft arrived in Berlin every minute, making a total of 277,804 flights and massive amounts of food and supplies. So at the end of that, the Soviets kind of give up and back off because clearly they're not achieving their aims. And so the blockade ends, those routes get reopened. But it's a fascinating episode because it shows the significance of this particular peculiar city. And of course, Berlin then gets its own significant symbol of the Cold War from 1961 in the form of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall goes up, and it goes up very quickly. After 3.5 million Germans, East Germans, vote with their feet and leave for the West between 1949 and 1961. And the Berlin Wall, the reason for it's an embarrassment, and it's just an embarrassment, but it needs to be done because it's an easy site. As I say, it's way over in the Russian zone, but if you get to Berlin, you can go to West Berlin, and then you're in West Germany. You've made it. You're out of the satellite state, or you're out of even the Soviet Union itself if you come from further afield, and you're in the West. And so 3.5 million people, or East Germans, did this between 1949 and 1961. The East German government needed to erect a barrier. And it's embarrassing because, it's supposed to be a communist paradise. Communism is supposed to be great. And yet there are all these people voting with their feet. And once the wall goes up, it is very fiercely policed. And there are at least 125 deaths trying to cross the Berlin Wall. And there you can see the wall at its height. And you can tell which side is the east side and which side is the west side. And here it is coming down. I didn't get the David Hasselhoff image. But one of the things that was done as part of propaganda and diplomacy during this period was that in West Berlin, concerts would be staged so that the music would travel across the wall. And so David Hasselhoff wrote a song, or was directed to write a song by his agent or manager, about looking for freedom, which was very much directed to this German audience and as propaganda to East Germany. In Asia, the conflicts tend to be less symbolic. I mean, we've had the Berlin blockade, we've got the Berlin Wall. I've said 125 people are killed, definitely killed, attempting to cross that barrier. And lots of people managed it in various ways. If you go into the history of it, I know there's a museum in Berlin that deals with attempts to tunnel under it, people hidden in cars, behind the seats with the stuffing taken out, people trying to balloon across into East Germany. People did take an immense risk to try and get to the West, and some of them succeeded. That's part of that Cold War culture as well, that idea of defection. Thriller writers used to be able to hang a plot on the whole idea of defection and helping someone get across, defect from the East when they wanted to come. They must really regret the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, because there's an awful lot of it embedded in cultural artifacts from that period. In Asia, as usual, it's a bit different. And it's a bit different because there's a whole lot more deaths. And there's some very warm wars as part of the Cold War. The first real war in Asia of this period is the Korean War, which takes the fighting's from 1950 through to 1953. I can't say that's the end of the war. So in 1953, there's a ceasefire, and the partition, the line across the country, is drawn essentially where the partition was drawn at the end of the Second World War. So technically, it's ceasefire. Technically, they're still at war. And so there is that demilitarized zone, and there's potential for that conflict to erupt. And also there's talk, although I think it's faded in more recent times, about how to manage any potential unification. So when Germany reunified after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was being watched very closely by South Korea in terms of how it would manage that process as well, should it get the opportunity. And there's work in South Korea to maintain a sense of what is going on in the north and to maintain a sense of unity in preparation should reunification become possible. But at the end of the Second World War, Korea gets divided up and partitioned between the Soviet Union and the United States. But fortunately, when war comes, and it comes unexpectedly, it's prompted by Kim Il-sung invading, trying to reunify the country by force. And so he comes very close to forcing the occupying forces out. And then there's a rebound as the United States Army sends its full military might and it pushes back up the peninsula. And so you get the North chasing down, the United States unified with the South, pushing right up to the Chinese border, at which point the Chinese become involved, and you get pushed back to the starting point. So it's a costly war. There were 3 million people killed in it, most of them civilians. And it ends where it started, and it ends not in peace, it ends in a ceasefire and that demilitarized zone being established. And that demilitarized zone, that uneasy truce, is reflected in other parts of Asia as well, particularly in that relationship between China and Taiwan, perhaps. It's an interesting war in what it does for Japan, because being a supply post actually really benefits the redevelopment of Japan in this period, just as when the Vietnam War, the American War gets started in Vietnam, it's very beneficial for Thailand, which provides R&R for soldiers. So this development of these ideological divides is interesting in terms of the fringe benefits of war, I guess you could say. And it's not the only hot part of the Cold War that occurs in Asia. There are also there's that significant conflict in Vietnam, which I'm not intending to spend any time on in the lecture. I expect that you've come across it frequently enough out of interest or because it's significant in popular culture. It's drawn out, it's expensive. Quite what each side was fighting for is still disputed. But I should draw your attention to the drawing, the depiction, and the quote in the bottom right hand of that slide, because it's a sign of why these wars were contested so fiercely. So in Korea, it's definitely the United States, it's China, and some interest from the Soviet Union, although it's made to look like a North Korean force. North Korean and China's acknowledged. In Vietnam, again, there's supply from communist forces for the North and the United States in the South. And the reason that the United States spends American lives, American money, fighting for these regions of the world that it has no strong cultural connection to is because of this ideology of the Cold War and this fear that if one place, you can see them set up as the dominoes, if one place tips over to communism, then that whole row of nations is going to go too, and you're going to be faced with a fully communist Asia. And for ideological reasons, that's unacceptable in this period of time. And so there's this willingness to spend money and lives fighting these wars. It's worth looking and recognizing that fun hall mirror, that it's not just the United States that does it. The Soviet Union has very much a Vietnam experience, it just has it in Afghanistan. Afghanistan in this period gets sucked into the Cold War. There's a pro-Soviet coup in 1978. Then there's rebellion by the Islamic warriors. We now know them as the Taliban, but they're supported. They're supported by the anything that's not communist United States. I understand there's a Rambo movie that is funded, in part funded by the State Department of the United States, as propaganda, where Rambo goes and links up with the Taliban and promotes this idea that these are the good guys. These are the good guys. We should be supporting them in this war because they're fighting the Soviet Union. So let's be clear, it's not just the United States getting sucked into Vietnam, it's also the Soviet Union getting sucked into a conflict it doesn't quite understand in Afghanistan. So it's happening from both sides of the Iron Curtain. And it's costly. The Soviet Union ends up withdrawing in 1989, so very much the way that the United States withdraws, just gets out of Vietnam. The Soviet Union gets out of Afghanistan, and their withdrawals followed by further civil war. So this is occurring in Asia. This is West Asia here. There's conflict in other parts of the world too, notably in the Americas. I've already mentioned that there's all sorts of stuff happening in the Americas in terms of American intervention in domestic politics in Latin America. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is an extraordinary piece of this Cold War history. And again, like the Berlin blockade, it doesn't erupt into an actual armed conflict, but it nearly destroys the planet. It occurs in 1962, and it's linked to the 1959 revolution, which had occurred there, which had removed Cuba as the United States client state, and Fidel Castro had been an opportunist. He'd claimed power at that point. It's also linked to a 1961 United States invasion, which went badly wrong. So it said the United States is interested in intervening against communism in Latin America. Here it's trying to do that in Cuba, and it has the Bay of Pigs. It trains these exiles, it arms them, it sends them back in to defeat Castro, and they don't. This crisis emerges in 1962, where United States spy planes flying over the island had identified sites being prepared for Soviet nuclear missiles. And this is the spy plane image that shows, if you know how to interpret it, apparently it shows these things. And genuinely, the sites were being developed. And it's terrifying for the United States because Cuba's right next door. This is why it's got such a strong interest in Latin America in this period, why it's interested in Cuba and the Caribbean, because missiles from Cuba will reach the United States before anything can be done to stop them. There is a naval blockade, and there follows negotiation with the Soviet leader Khrushchev. And after that, there's a tactical retreat by both sides. So Khrushchev agrees to uninstall the missiles here if the United States agrees at a slightly later date, not obviously connected to this process, to get its missiles out of Turkey. And we're extraordinarily lucky that this negotiation was successful, because for 13 days it looked like World War III was going to erupt, that we were going to have global thermonuclear war. And this little crisis in Cuba over the placement of a few nuclear missiles could have destroyed everybody on the planet, which really highlights the stakes had the superpowers gone head to head. So in these wars in Afghanistan, these wars in Vietnam, these wars in Korea, the superpowers, they might be in conflict, but only one is openly in the conflict. In Cuba, they both would have been openly in it. And so it would have been devastating. By 1960s, there's a recognition that we're living in a mad world. And so it's a terrifying period to live in, because this is the deliberate aim. This is what these arsenals are geared up for, that if we're attacked, we will destroy the planet. And that's reflected very neatly in this artifact that's produced by the Bureau of the Atomic Scientists in Chicago. So these are people who are genuine scientists. They developed this tool in 1947. And the idea is people who know the state of development of nuclear weapons, who understand politics, each year make a decision on how close we are to global nuclear annihilation. That's what midnight is on this clock. I think it's something perhaps we're more familiar with than when I first started using it as an image in my lectures in about 2010. You can see that since 2010, we've been creeping ever closer to midnight, because while all these events occurred as the Cold War ended, you can see here the end of the Cold War, there would be the fall of the Berlin Wall. As a species, we seem determined to destroy ourselves and to keep on ratcheting up the tension. So I'm going to bring us quickly to the end of the Cold War and note that the Soviet Union lost it. We're extraordinarily lucky. We're lucky with the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev in particular, that while the Soviet Union, for economic reasons, you can argue for economic reasons, it was always going to lose, again, as a war of production, or as a war perhaps not of production but of consumption and of the happiness of citizens as a result of actually having stuff worthwhile to consume. The Soviet Union was locked into losing it, but the fact that it ended without global nuclear war was extraordinary. And so it ends with, it's a bit difficult to pick the exact moment. There's the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and there is an exact moment there because it's very strange. The fall of the Berlin Wall was sudden and unexpected, as was the collapse of communism. Nobody really saw it coming. David Hasselhoff, in that image on the slide, thinks he had a hand in it. Perhaps he did. But in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it happens literally overnight, in that the theory is the announcement was made that there would be free travel between the two parts of Berlin. That announcement was made by accident. That the party member who was reading the announcement read the wrong announcement. He was in a press conference. There was a backup announcement ready. He wasn't supposed to read it, but he did. And that announcement suggested that the gates would be open and that it would be possible to travel freely from East Berlin to West Berlin. People in East Berlin were extremely excited about this, and they turned up. They turned up at the gates, they turned up at the checkpoints, they turned up in their pajamas. And fortunately, the border guards accepted what was happening and they were let through without violence. Most people went through to West Berlin. A lot of them grabbed bananas because bananas were not available on the east, and then they went home again. They went back to their jobs, their houses, their lives, many of them clutching bananas as proof that they had actually been to the west that night. But it's an extraordinary event, and Germany is reunified within a year from that event. West Germany had been preparing for this. It was a generous offer that they made that the Eastern currency would be matched 1-to-1. The East German mark would be matched 1-to-1 with the West German mark. There was generosity and there was hope in the process of the reunification, which is partly why it happened so fast and to such good effect. And in those links below the image of David Hasselhoff, who I realise may not be quite such a pop culture figure for you as for me, I'm showing my age again this week, but in those links below that image of David Hasselhoff, there are a whole lot of cultural artefacts that spring from this moment. And there is a wellspring of optimism and of euphoria. As the Soviet Union falls apart, as the Soviet Union's form of communism collapses, thankfully it doesn't all end in World War III. Instead, the Soviet bloc collapses peacefully, thanks in large part to Mikhail Gorbachev. And there's a sense of the world united. And there's hopefulness around that. There's hopefulness about free trade, about the spread of culture and consumer goods. And there's a response to that as well, in terms of fears about the power of large multinational organizations, corporations in particular, and a sense that we need to fulfill the promise of global justice. One of the ideas that gets picked up is that history has ended. It's not just the Cold War that has ended, but humankind has reached a new phase of development. Now, a lot of this euphoria for a new phase in human history was captured in a book by Francis Fukuyama, which was titled The End of History and the Last Man. Francis Fukuyama argued that with the collapse of communism, we were seeing the triumph of liberal democracy, that humankind had found its political order, that it was global and everywhere, and that we'd arrived in the millennium, if you like. I find those ideas kind of intriguing because to me they seem an echo of Marxism, the idea that society has to go through various phases of development until it reaches its final perfect phase. And there's an argument that part of this loss of the Cold War was promoted by Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program for space war. Unfortunately, it's a nice economic argument. It's an interesting one, and it fits in with the idea of the Cold War as often it's a war of deception as well as anything else. Here's an image of a missile that was rolled out every year. The Soviet Union had a big military technology parade, in theory to show its citizens how great it was. In practice, knowing that there would be foreign spies paying attention, it would roll out stuff which was not real, like this thing. Here's a great big whacking missile that you're going to have to waste time finding out about, but actually it doesn't work. So the Soviet Union collapses and we end the Cold War for a while at least. It's something, again, that you might like to bring up in tutorial. But I hope I've given you a sense of just how peculiar this post-World War II period was and the links that existed between different parts of the world, and that you've got an idea now of what this bipolar world looked like, of these two opposing forces of communism and capitalism that developed in this period.